and then we'll continue the conversation around this topic throughout the year and as things develop on our connection site. So without any other further ado, we are going to hand it over to Jim. Okay. Here you go, Mr. Finley.
Well, I'm glad to be here, everybody. We all have so many questions about altered political environment that really none of us were expecting. And now we're trying to get our feet on the ground and see what is going to happen for us all and try and get a better fix on how this impacts the profession. So what are we doing today? First of all, we are going to be talking about the election results and what they portend for healthcare and the future in the organization of financing of care. What is it that most directly concerns mental health counselors, and the policy and political challenges that confront the Congress and therefore the profession. We would point out this is a much different environment than we have had in any past, I don't know, many decades. So we're definitely in uncharted territory for all of us in terms of how the Hill and the presidency will operate. So before we get too depressed, I thought it was just worth mentioning some of the successes that we've had with respect to the recognition of the profession. So I arbitrarily picked a point 10 years ago, and we'll start there and just mention that, first of all, it was in '06 when our profession was first under statute recognized for independent practice within the VA health system. In 2010, the IOM, the Institute of Medicine, reported standards for the independent practice of clinical mental health counseling under TRICARE. They, for the first time, recommended uniform standards for the education, examination, credentialing, and supervision of clinical practice. Then job specs, noting that there were 4 years between when Congress acted and when the VA put up job specs to actually hire our people. So one lesson is it takes a long time for entrenched federal bureaucracies to move even on a statutory change. In 2010, it was also the last year that, the last state, I should say, that formally licensed clinical mental health counselors. So we've had all 50 states since 2010. In 2011, Congress directed the DOD to adopt regulations recognizing independent practice within the TRICARE program, and then they subsequently released a final rule later on that year. Since then, we have had a steady flow of our practitioners getting independent practice status within TRICARE. Why is it not advancing? There we go. AMCA called on all mental health counselors in 2012 to seek CACREP accreditation. So we went out to the group of ACES, or counseling educators, to embrace CACREP accreditation. SAMHSA at that same point in 2012 called on CACREP graduation for its requirement to move into their minority fellowship program. So it's beginning to take on some steam by 2012. We had, again, another step toward unification as the VA began slowly to hire folks exclusively that are CACREP recognized, or graduates of CACREP recognized programs. I should add, that was not at our recommendation. While we strongly recommend that programs seek CACREP accreditation, we do not recommend that any federal agency exclusively employ folks that are graduates of CACREP programs. So we have been, all these years, seeking appropriate grandfather language. In 2014, rules were issued under TRICARE to begin to bring our people in as independent practitioners. And then also in 2014 at the end, NBCC announced that all NCE applicants would need to come from CACREP accredited programs starting first in 2021. What does that mean? It means that in states that require a licensure applicant to take the NCE, in order to take the NCE and get the NCC, they're going to have to come through CACREP accredited programs by 2021. So what that all means is that the remaining programs, there's not all that many left, but there are certainly some programs in some states that are not yet CACREP accredited. So we're going to see those last programs very likely coming under CACREP accreditation by 2021. And then the VA partnered first with our training programs last year, and mental health counselors and all state licensed licensees were brought into the VA's Veteran Choice program again last year. What does that mean? It means folks that are not graduates of CACREP accredited programs can begin to participate in the privatized program in the VA. So we're making little nudges forward. And then lastly, AMCA in late last year finalized its agreement on portability with NBCC and ACES. And I should add, we're currently now talking with the counseling accreditation, the state board group, as well as the American Counseling Association on a further consensus around the issue of portability. So portability remains very much in our plate and very actively in play now among all the major national organizations representing counselors. The unfinished business. Well, where are we right at this very moment? Firstly, our top priority, and I think everybody in the profession would largely say that Medicare provider status for the profession is the most key thing we have going forward on our plate. We need to improve professional unification among the states on education, training, supervision, and particularly, again, portability, because there is this very high level of variability among the states for their standards for both the education and licensure of practitioners. We need to try and bring that together with a unification of standards so that it is easier for practitioners to move across state lines. We are continuing to press for increased hiring within the VA. There is a slow uptick, so that's not a hopeless situation by any means. Other statutory work we need to do is we need to expand the definition of what is the mental health workforce under federal law. That's a data collection issue, but it's important to us because it helps to define what is the need for mental health counselors around the country. We need recognition within the Federal Department of Transportation Substance Abuse Treatment Program, and then we need to do increased collaboration with the state counseling boards as well as the counselor educators, NBCC, and the ACA. And that is, like I say, right now something we're very much engaged with. Where are we going next year? Just around the corner. Well, here's the basic landscape. There's a couple of more Democratic seats in the Senate. It's now 52 Republicans, 48 Dems. A key question is, will reconciliation be used again? Why is that key? Because reconciliation is the method the Senate uses to get around the 60-vote filibuster. Very important. Will it last? We might be in the last throes of 60-vote margins to do much of anything. It was a huge barrier to the Democrats making much progress in recent years. So now it is to the Republicans' advantage to beat down the filibuster, to limit the use of the filibuster. So that's a very big change going forward. There is certainly a very hard right agenda right now among health policymakers on Capitol Hill and in the next administration. So the question is going to be, is the Senate going to help to temper some of that, or are they going to be as hard right as their compatriots in the House? In the House, it's going to be 240 Republicans, 195 Dems. That's, again, the Democratic margin there is a tiny bit stronger than what it had been in this current year. But it's going to, that's a very majority-dominated body, and you just don't get too far in the minority there. There is a very restive GOP caucus there. The hard right is driving things that will become important on healthcare reform going forward. And constituents absolutely expect major movement next year on healthcare issues. So there's a real sense among Republicans on Capitol Hill that they must deliver real change in healthcare. So what did candidate Trump have to say? Everybody says these words, create a patient-centered healthcare system that promotes choice, quality, and affordability. Nobody disagrees with that. That's what he said. Every Democrat I've ever heard would echo those same words. So in other words, they're fairly meaningless. So you have to put some actual mechanisms in healthcare that will help to define what that means to promote choice, quality, and affordability. Certainly, he has made a cornerstone of his agenda to promote the use of what's called personal health or medical savings account. That means that a taxpayer sets aside a certain amount of money, tax-free, in a savings account that's designated for their personal health care use. If you're making $30,000 a year, you obviously can't afford to put aside a significant amount of money in a health savings account, perhaps none. So the health savings account is a meaningful vehicle for people at relatively high incomes, because we all know that healthcare is really easy to blow through $5,000, $10,000. So a healthcare savings account with a small amount of money isn't going to provide any real protection against a major medical expense. It can be very useful if you have a high income. To reestablish risk pools for high-risk individuals that have not maintained continuous coverage. In the past, before the ACA, some states had established high-risk pools where people with pre-existing medical conditions who couldn't get any other coverage will go to get a limited array of services. They were far too underfunded. Those were all the high-risk cases, people with self-insurance, people unable to work. That's where they all ended up. High-risk pools were an abysmal failure a decade and more ago. And that's largely because of underfunding. You're talking hundreds of millions of dollars are necessary in a high-risk pool. What it is it basically sticks the uninsured or the uninsurable in a state into a separate pool, and the state subsidizes them for a piece of their care. But with all those high-risk lives, that's where all the money goes. Trump definitely would promote the sale of insurance across state lines. That's been seen by Republican policy for many years. Some states have already authorized them. Health plans hate them. They don't offer them. So that's sort of an offering without much teeth. There's no evidence that they work, and health plans believe that they are an unprofitable loser with all kinds of operational problems. So again, that's regardless of what the Congress might do, that's not going to be, buying insurance across state lines isn't going to solve anybody's problems or get any care. And then very importantly, convert Medicaid to a state block grant program. That's going to be key going forward. And then just for a couple of quotes from the president-elect, he would fix our broken mental health system. Let's be clear about this. Our mental health system is broken. It must be fixed. Too many politicians have ignored this problem for too long. Finally, this is again Trump's plan. Finally, we need to reform our mental health programs and institutions in this country. Families without the ability to get the information needed to help those who are willing, who are ailing, are too often not given the tools to help their loved ones. There are promising reforms being developed in Congress that should receive bipartisan support. He's referring there to the Mental Health Act, which is just passed the Senate 2 days ago and seems likely to be signed by Mr. Obama. It is bipartisan. There remains not one dime of new mental health money in that what's now known as the Cures Act, which included a mental health title, but there's still no new money in it. And money for new spending in the new fiscal year is going to be harder to come by than the current fiscal year. What else can we see happening already? He has 2 key appointees, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2 key ones, but in essence, they're very hardline healthcare conservatives, and they are extremely capable people, and they will be forces to be reckoned with. The new folks, these guys, the new people that he's appointing, don't display Trump's penchant for shuffling politics or policy that was evident during the campaign. These are people that are very hardline on block granting Medicaid, privatizing Medicare, and repealing Obamacare, perhaps leaving nothing behind. So these are hardline people that are going to be forces to be reckoned with. Tom Price he's currently a Republican of Georgia. He's a physician, very conservative, has a well-documented history on repealing Obamacare. He knows Obamacare well. Unlike many in his party, he actually understands what he's doing, and in essence, I would describe his agenda under repeal and replace as complete repeal and marginal replacement, looking at not leaving much behind, including eliminating the pre-existing condition exclusion. So that's very problematic. His new CMMS administrator, that's the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Seema Verma, she is currently Mr. Pence's ally in Indiana and has been his key consultant working to privatize some Medicaid services in Indiana. She is extremely capable on the Medicaid side of things. She has no history whatsoever on the Medicare side of things. She's strictly a state Medicaid policy person. So she's an unknown on the Medicare side, unlike Tom Price, the secretary, who has a very long history on Medicare privatization. Seema Verma, basically, again, it's about complete block granting of the program, and it's going to be a lot about leaving a lot more discretion in the hands of the individual in what kind of care they seek, and expecting, I should say, requiring the Medicaid beneficiaries to make co-payments, pay a share of their premium costs. Among the biggest concern with the current Indiana Medicaid program is what's going to be the impact. And it's a relatively new waiver program in place in Indiana, but the big concern is what's going to happen when Medicaid beneficiaries there don't make their cost sharing required, don't make their monthly premium co-payments, because there are small co-payments required for most Medicaid beneficiaries in Indiana, particularly on the monthly premium side. So if every beneficiary has to make a monthly premium payment and they don't make it, then they can lose it for 6 months to a year. They become ineligible for any Medicaid. It's a way to make sure that they pay their Medicaid. The concern is that in Indiana, a recipient that is mentally ill may not consistently make payments for their Medicaid and could therefore lose eligibility for 6 months to a year. So that if that gets replicated under federal law, that's a big deal. Repeal and replace, repeal and delay, those are all the questions on everybody's mind right now. Speaker Ryan and everybody else in the new Republican leadership fully intends to use reconciliation. Again, that's a tool to repeal Obamacare as one of the chamber's first acts. They are working that out right now as we speak. They can do a lot on the repeal side through reconciliation, that tool, but they can't do anything with replacement. It's out of order. It's under that procedure. So essentially that forces them to do repeal now if they want to keep that promise, and do replace down the line. And right now their thinking is 2 to 3 years. There's a huge controversy within the Republican caucus in the House on can they wait 2 to 3 years. Many members feel a political imperative to move much faster on replace. So that's going to be a big deal. They clearly, many members in the House GOP have never considered in a serious way what would effectively replace the current program. And replace, what that would mean basically is how do you maintain something close to current coverage for close to the current number of beneficiaries. Certainly the Senate in particular is looking to work with Democrats on a replacement program. So the Senate GOP leadership is thinking past the repeal bill and looking now at the replace and thinking how will they be able to pick up some of the Republican votes. So that's a very key issue, is will Democrats be willing to participate in a replacement program. That's part of the reason to wait 3 years, is to give Democrats in the Senate in particular time to kind of hear from their own constituents about the value of a replacement program. What are they targeting? First and foremost, the individual mandate. That seems unlikely to continue under Obamacare. Basically, the current mandate is you either maintain a certified, an ACA compliant plan, or you pay a penalty under your IRS tax return. There's deep resentment of that across the country among the electorate, and certainly on Capitol Hill. They are certainly going to undo that to a significant degree. Their current idea up there right now is to eliminate it and replace it with a penalty for beneficiaries, insureds, to come in and pay a higher, for those that lose, who give up coverage for a month or more, say because they're unemployed, or they simply maybe forgot to make a payment for a few months, they would then have to permanently pay a much higher premium when they came back into the risk pool. It's a very big issue because many people in the individual market are not steadily paying premiums, and they would therefore lose the ability to get coverage that meets current federal standards. Again, treatment of pre-existing conditions, very huge issue for our population. I'm sure most of you that were practicing 10 years ago remember well pre-existing condition limitations. That too, it seems highly likely that the current prohibition on pre-existing conditions is going to end, and the question is what then might take its place. Coverage for adult dependents under age 26, that's not a huge problem with the risk pools. It's not a huge technical problem. It might get tweaked, but I would say that has bipartisan support and will probably continue. Of highest concern for our people, for you all, is going to be the essential health benefits package that exists under Obamacare, that exists and has already spilled into ACA compliant plans in the private sector. So the essential health benefit, along with mental health parity, which link up under statute and enforcement, those are at great peril, is the best way I could describe them. Mental health groups, that is the issue that they are overwhelmingly going to focus on. There are key GOP leaders that are saying loudly and clearly to us that they intend to maintain the mental health parity protections. We're going to drill down on that a little bit later. But the problem with the mental health parity is unless it is linked up to an essential health benefit array, it's not clear that mental health parity has any meaning absent a clearly defined general medical benefit, outpatient, those kinds of questions. Prevention benefits, that would include like contraception, immunizations, those seem likely to disappear. There's some talk like a return to association health plans, certainly a reintroduction of lifetime or annual limits. Those are in play. Republicans generally all want to cap medical liability, damage awards, so that seems likely to show up in a replacement plan. And then very importantly, some sort of a bailout. There's going to be tremendous upheaval if repeal passes and there's no immediate replacement plan that is known and, you know, in an orderly way transitioning to it. So the Congress is, if they're going to do a quick repeal, which is what they are adamant that they will do, they're going to need to bail out the current plans who want to get out of this thing, who want to get out of their current coverage very quickly. If Congress repeals, they're going to be breaching their contracts with current ACA plans. So what does that mean? It means that the ACA plans can pull out very quickly, depending on the wording of replacement. So they're going to have to shore up current ACA plans against unanticipated losses. Because as people start to move out of their current ACA plans, it's going to increasingly leave behind just very high-cost patients who have to stay in them. So that's why the bailout. Is it Armageddon for persons with mental illness? That's what everybody's asking in this town. The ACA created the largest expansion of mental health and substance abuse disorder coverage in a generation. The current director of the National Drug Control Policy Center says that about 60 million people with mental illness and substance abuse disorders received coverage under plans covered by the ACA. That is, both new exchange plans and the private small group plans as well as individual plans. What does that mean? Many people have already forgotten how insurance was structured prior to the ACA. So you've got current ACA participating beneficiaries. You've got the private small group plans who are not now participating in the ACA, but we brought them in under mental health parity requirements using the ACA. So that was very important. And we brought in all individual plans under the ACA. They too must have mental health parity. So that's why we reached people in Obamacare, we reached people in small group plans, and we reached individuals, because everybody, regardless of in or out of the exchanges, you had to be buying Obamacare compliant plans as a condition of staying compliant with your IRS requirement that you buy compliant coverage in order to avoid paying the penalty. So because there were so many folks prior to the ACA who were uninsured for mental illness and substance abuse coverage, when we came in back in 2010 and added mental health parity coverage, we enormously expanded the availability of coverage. So that's what's now at risk, because it all hangs inside the ACA. There's about 22 million people currently covered directly under the ACA, either through Medicaid expansion in the 32 states that now have Medicaid expansion plans, or through their state exchanges. The care for people with pre-existing condition includes mental illness. So again, we picked up a lot of people, added a lot of coverage for people just because pre-existing condition exclusions were eliminated. All told, we believe that the uninsured rate for people with serious psychological distress dropped from 28% in 2012 to 19% last year. So we're talking about a major drop. It's continuing to drop to today. So there's a lot more at risk for our beneficiaries than for others. Full repeal will cut off millions from mental health and substance abuse treatment. All right. The polity, what I call GOP parity policy dissonance. In general, with healthcare, they favor less regulation, including fewer mandates. Donald Trump, candidates like Donald Trump, Senator Rob Portman, Rand Paul, all made combating substance abuse and expanding access to treatment cornerstones of their 2016 campaigns, but they also supported full repeal, which is the way we have already greatly expanded the availability of service. So again, it just doesn't make it, it just doesn't add up under law, and what they've expressed is their goal. GOP mental health leader Tim Murphy in the House, he also backs full repeal. He's also assured us privately and quite publicly that he's going to support a retention of parity in any replacement plan, but he too is a supporter of eliminating an essential or a standard benefit package. So how he gets there, we don't know. They're mapping out the repeal plans today. Where it goes is what we're paying attention to. Candidate Trump says that he is open to banning insurers from denying coverage for pre-existing conditions. That is not where his Secretary of HHS is coming from. He's quite clear that he would deny people the ability to easily move between plans in and out of coverage and maintain a ban on their pre-existing conditions. So there's a lot of dissonance between what candidates have said and what actual people who are on the ground trying to make all of this work, how this all fits together. Federal parity law, I should mention to everybody, because we've all long forgotten that back in 2006 there was a Domenici-Wellstone parity law. That applied to large plans of 50 and over insureds. So that is under 2006 law. It is outside of Obamacare. So it's the one piece of federal parity we should be able to retain simply because it's not riding inside the ACA. So people with larger plans, we think they're going to be okay. It's everybody else who got added through provisions inside the ACA that is at risk. And I should say I expect that most of us will be making it a top priority going forward in this debate. Medicare privatization, and I would point out my last bullet is probably the most important here. Medicare privatization is very helpful to mental health counselors, and that is because mental health counselors have an already long-established history of participating under Medicare Advantage plans. They get in those networks, they see over 65 people because they look just like everybody else that's coming through, say, a Kaiser or a Blue Cross Blue Shield Medicare Advantage plan. So privatization of Medicare, while it might carry many other objectionable policy consequences, it might be something that AMCA would support simply because it is a way for us to get our people recognized. So we've got Tom Price, who's going to be the head of HHS. He supports major changes, including Medicare privatization. Medicare premium support is essentially what privatization is about. It hands the beneficiary something like a voucher. It's cash, and it's a partial subsidy to go out into the marketplace and to purchase a federally certified, recognized benefit plan. Democrats say that premium support would not keep up with rising health care costs, forcing more costs onto beneficiaries. And certainly under Tim Ryan is among the biggest, very vocal people that supports this. And certainly under the Ryan plan, he would strictly cap at something like the Consumer Price Index the premium on the Medicare side. The problem is we all know that healthcare cost increases accelerate well above the CPI. So then the question becomes is as these things become more like vouchers and they don't keep up with the rising healthcare costs, who ends up on the hook? So it's a very, very big issue to beneficiaries of how does the dollar value of Medicare keep up with the rising cost of health care. Adverse selection becomes a major risk if they maintain the traditional Medicare program for people that want it, and that's what they say they would like to do. So the problem is that people with more complex needs who need access to specialty providers, if they remain in traditional Medicare, while people with lower risk who are relatively younger jump into private plans, it skews the risk groups badly, and that produces higher costs. I should say that current Medicare Advantage plans have a significantly higher per capita cost already, even though we also know that they're a relatively younger, healthier population than the traditional Medicaid program. So privatization, as it has been structured to date, certainly will drive costs higher on a per capita basis. Republicans allege falsely that Medicare will become insolvent if changes aren't made. Actually, because Medicare privatization increases per capita spending for the program, privatization in and of itself will increase the drawdown on the Medicare Trust Fund. So they're going to have to come up with another way to cap that program, either capping it below the Consumer Price Index or some other mechanism that arbitrarily limits spending so that they can continue to push more people into a privatized program. So that's a very huge problem that they will have to confront, is the fact that on a per capita basis, it's more expensive to serve people in privatized plans. Democrats are chomping at the bit for a privatization fight. They would love to take on the Republicans on that issue. And of course, you know, this is a major point of disagreement between Trump and his leadership in the House and the Senate. There's no question the Republican leadership are eager to privatize Medicare, particularly the Speaker, particularly the incoming Secretary of HHS. So that's going to be a fascinating struggle as we go forward. Medicaid. Block granting is clearly what everyone is expecting. It is going to be a huge fight. And why is that? Because there's a formula issue. Right now, Medicaid spending among the states is grossly skewed. And per capita funding between them varies tremendously, and that's because states cover different things, different conditions, different services, different populations. So if you block grant it and give each state an allocation, which is based upon their historical, say, recent historical spending, that greatly disadvantages states going forward. And why is that? Because states are encountering different demographic and economic changes. Many states are doing very well economically. They can afford to spend more on Medicare. Many low-income states are doing worse, and they have adverse demographic changes, particularly they're aging. And if you don't have a formula that addresses the business or the relative poverty, the relative economic condition of each state, if you don't have a formula that addresses the demographic changes that are happening, then over time, a state can really, really get hammered. That's a huge concern for places like, say, Florida, with a rapidly aging population, with its long-term care costs rapidly ahead of the rest of the nation. Florida is also a state that did not take Medicaid expansion dollars. So again, as you look at block granting Medicaid, those expansion dollars that have never hit into Florida, but let's say went in large mass to Michigan or New York or California, if those dollars don't get reallocated in the formula, Florida is permanently greatly damaged. So how Florida and some of the southern states, mostly southern states, and a few Midwestern states that didn't pick up Medicaid expansion, those states are enormously harmed. So I foresee an enormous battle among essentially governors and therefore their Senate representatives over that formula. It could really delay the whole Medicaid block granting process. If they can agree to a formula that most Republicans are supportive of, then I would say advocates don't think it could ever be restored back to the old program. So block granting Medicaid is regarded as a transformative event in the healthcare system, and it could probably never be repealed. There are other things that are at issue, right? I mentioned Medicaid expansion dollars. The other thing is CHIP. That's the Child Health Insurance Program. It is an expiring authorization. Again, it's another issue that adds fuel to the fire of the formula fight. What do you do with the CHIP dollars? What do you do with the Medicaid expansion dollars? What do you do with the core dollars? Huge issue. What does it matter for our people? We got a whole heck of a lot of mentally ill people covered under Medicaid across the state. That's about the growth curve or the cut curve. Block grants also, of course, like all block grant proposals, would greatly cut for the first-year funding going forward. So it's not like you're going to get whatever you got last year. It might be 10% lower, it might be 20% lower, it might be 30%. The thinking right now is 20 to 30% cut overall. And then if you scramble that formula to creating, gross winners and losers over time, it's a billion-dollar consequence for the states. Huge issues. All right, other legislative concerns. The current ACA exchanges were imbalanced and needed to deal with some risk pool adjustments. Carriers, everybody expected Hillary Clinton was going to win, and those fixes, those statutory fixes that are required were going to happen. That's why the current carrier group stayed in. They expected things to change this January. They won't be changing that way. So that's why there's a lot of pressure being felt by the carriers to pull out and not stay in what they regard as a deeply broken exchange environment today. Bids for 2018 are due May 1st. Then the actual contracts are signed around September 1st. So plans are going to be getting ready to start to bail quickly. Certainly by summer, they'll be announcing whether or not they're going to stay in. There are other legislative things coming up. The federal debt ceiling is a huge issue. Historically, Republicans excuse me, hate supporting the debt ceiling. They are proposing major tax cuts that are going to greatly exacerbate the debt. So the debt ceiling is going to need to be passed. That is a crisis in the making. Appropriations, the Republicans coming in want to change federal spending. Most importantly, Trump wants to increase Department of Defense spending and presumably cut domestic spending to pay for it. That's a big deal. With all the changes happening on the revenue side, it's hard to imagine that they couldn't also be simultaneously making major changes on the domestic spending side. There's a procedure called sequestration that's still on the books and will happen on the 1st of October. Other things going on the legislative front, there is a strong Republican initiative to privatize the Department of Veterans Affairs. That could absolutely work to our advantage. It's highly controversial, very likely to blow up in the faces of the GOP proponents, whether they decide to hold on that to next year. My guess is they'll hold on that and let some of the other healthcare issues get worked through this year and then move on to VA privatization. Again, that could be very helpful to our people, but hugely controversial. Where are we on Medicare recognition? Well, I would point out there's one good piece of news here, which is there's a new chairman coming in for the House Energy and Commerce Committee. His name is Greg Walden. He's from Oregon. He is a supporter of ours. He's been on as a co-sponsor of the current House bill. So he's got some sympathy for this. As a chairman of the Committee of Jurisdiction, which the House Energy and Commerce Committee has jurisdiction on Medicare, he will be unwilling, we strongly suspect, to co-sponsor our bill next year. So that means it's incumbent upon us to find another member who's willing to take on championing our bill on the committee. But nevertheless, we know he's got a soft spot in his heart for our bill. So that's a very good thing. There are two committees with jurisdiction in the House, Energy and Commerce, the other one's Ways and Means Committee. We don't have any strong Republican support really on the Ways and Means Committee. So that's something we're going to have to build. We will need to have new bills introduced in the new Congress. It is very hard for us to find Republican champions for our bill. And by that I mean the lead sponsor. Our current Republican sponsor in the House is retiring at the end of this week. And so we need a new champion to get out front on that issue. After we get a GOP leader on the bill in the House, then we're going to be continuing to emphasize very strongly getting more Republicans on the House bill. It is very difficult for us to do that, and we're going to be asking all of our constituencies to put real focus on the Republican representatives to get them on our bill. We very, very often hear, as a matter of fact, most visits that I make on the Hill with our coalition, with our Provider Status Coalition, we hear there's not much grassroots support from constituents to get on the bill. So that's simply telling us that our people aren't making enough noise in Republican districts. Lacking money and clout, it is essential for the profession to raise its activity level on the Hill. I should also add that with Medicare privatization or voucherization, whatever expression you want to use, with that being on the table, I expect there may be some Republicans who simply say, we don't want to worry about the traditional program. Next year we're going to pass our privatization bill, and the issue of the traditional program will go away. And so I don't know how they're going to frame changes like we are asking on the traditional program up against their desire to privatize. So it's a challenge to us that we're going to have to work through next year. What is the advocacy response for you all and for us? We need to learn the new rules of advocacy, respond to requests from AMCA. We are more threatened than we have been in the past, so people are going to have to be more active dealing one-on-one with their legislators, sending messages, going to events that their legislators sponsor back home in the districts. We're going to need to work more closely with our congressional champions, particularly Republicans. We're going to be having to practice more shared messaging with our coalition partners so that we better coordinate the timing of things. We're having more problems with each of us doing our own timing of our messaging, and that gets confusing for our grassroots. I would also hasten that if there's any lesson of the recent past on health policy, it's the public doesn't understand a thing about health policy. So it's important that you all educate your patients, your communities, your opinion leaders in your community about the value of mental health services and the value of services that you provide, particularly on the cost effectiveness side. That is something that is absolutely not understood by the public. So anything you can do to help bring your story to opinion leaders in your communities, that would be greatly helpful. We are right now working on a public affairs program for people, some material, so an awareness program for people to use with local opinion leaders, and we'll be rolling that out over the next few months. Also, again, talk about your constructive policy ideas. Right now, we have a climate in this town which is very negative about Obamacare. Well, fine, but we need to have some hard alternatives, things that we know can work. So we need to be talking up the constructive things that we can do that'll help move the ball forward. Going forward, what are we going to be doing? Well, we're going to be boosting our national activity. That's going to be working for you because our office isn't getting any bigger, sadly. So it's going to be more about what you can do and how we can support more of what you can do. We're going to be moving more into the public relations and communications tactics. We're going to be asking for more letters, more visits. We're going to be encouraging you to pick up your pitchforks. In particular, we're going to be asking you to reach out to our non-members to get them involved, to encourage them to join in AMCA's advocacy efforts. We simply just need more numbers in the profession speaking up. I would also add that I find very often among our constituents that because they're clinicians and they're all about reason and things, they like to think that practice is based on data and science, I would say that's all fine. I would say, yeah, data, fine. That doesn't win the game in this town. This is about how people feel about healthcare reform. This is about how people feel about what it costs. It doesn't matter that the nation spends about $10,000 per capita annually on healthcare costs. People feel, oh, I only use my insurance a little bit. They have no clear concept whatsoever what healthcare costs. So we have got to recognize that there is so much disinformation, so much emotion that's driving health policy decision making as opposed to reason. So while we are going to talk about what the data show, recognize that this is also an emotional, it's a political argument. It's about making noise. So legislators, sure, they want data, but they're going to need a lot more than good data. Everybody's got some good data. We're sort of in a post-factual environment, so think of it in those terms. Is that facts are fine, but it's like, what have you done for me lately? Have you supported me? Have you made clear that there's 100 people out here behind me? That's what we're going to be looking at. And then lastly, we're going to ask people to relate their experience to what's going on in their states, what's going on in their districts. So I'm going to pause there and ask people for comments, questions, whatever is on their mind. I didn't share my webcam before? Oh, you should have come in. All right, hi everybody.
I don't have any questions right now. I just want to remind everyone the handout for today, the PowerPoint for today is in the handout section on your thing. Please submit questions in the question box. Jim and I are here. Okay, here's a question. Michael says, are we going to let the American Counseling Association determine our license title? How are we going to deal with our license title?
Okay. Well, that's a state level decision. No, we have our own recommendations. Typically licensed mental health counselor, clinical mental health counselor. But that's a state level fight. We don't agree with what they say, and if somebody needs a letter of support on that to take into their state chapter, we will certainly raise that. But it's a state issue, title determination. There's nothing federal to do about that. So we would support our chapters in it, whatever they want to do. And I would say that for those of you that have done some work across state lines, you'll find that pretty much everybody in this business likes and admires whatever title it is that they're used to in their own state. So change is hard on titles, but people are generally comfortable with wherever they are. As a gross generalization, I would say that's true.
We have a few people on the call who are with the Florida chapter's legislative committee. So we have a few people. They wanted to a reminder of this, of the what you did for their state, for their letter that they wrote.
Right. We have sent one to Florida recently on the title issue. So, you know, we'll be happy to support states on that issue. But, you know, we're not going to send in a lobbyist, say, directly to do that. But our, you know, we might have a board member who would make a statement for you in that state, for example. So, what people
and do you
need.
see any alternative for those programs that are non-KCREP graduates? A
No.
question that we have from Suzanne.
From Suzanne. Well, if you're, should a current training program get KCREP accredited? Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no alternative to that, and maintaining licensure in most states. So because of the NCE requirement come 2022. However, sure, there's lots of opportunities for non-KCREP grads, for people that have been licensed for some time. Sure. I mean, we've made a little progress on the VA side. There's been a lot of progress on the TRICARE side. So I don't see that as a practice killer if you're not from a KCREP accredited program. But going forward, as we try to deal with some of these portability issues, as we try to deal with future federal recognition issues, it's going to be a whole lot easier if we have unified standards for training.
Wonderful. Another question from Michael. He wants to ask again, is our policy in line with, or our recommendations in line with NBCC and in the NCMHCE and those certifications?
Yes. On portability, yes. Yeah. And I would say we're not even in disagreement with the ACA on some of this stuff. It's just a matter, where we do disagree with the ACA is on the title, the appropriate title. But in terms of portability and unification, we're largely in agreement with them. I mean, I don't know of any major counseling organization which is not advocating KCREP recognition for our training programs.
Great. We have another question from Ms. Avery. Many of the VAs, the Veterans Affairs require licensure for their positions. However, they are hurting for clinicians. What's the, will the requirement change in the future, or is there a solution for that?
Well, there's no way you're going to get recognized for independent practice anywhere without licensure, so I presume that's not quite the right language there. Is there an interest, I'm going to guess that what you're asking is there an opportunity for non-KCREP accredited licensees to practice independently within the VA? That would be a sensible question, and...
Yes, she says yes, that's what she's asking.
Yeah, okay. Okay. I mean, that's longer term. The front and center issue is privatization. And again, I mean, you know, if you're not employing, if you're going to privatize the whole agency, why do we care about who they hire? I mean, that's not an issue if you're not hiring. So, you know, that in the logic of the incoming people, they're not particularly concerned about who's recognized inside the agency. They would just as soon make them all unemployed and throw them into the community and let them compete for veterans services. So right now we do have the Veterans Choice Program, which is in the communities, and our people, all licensees, are recognized under that. So, you know, if Veterans Choice is the model toward privatization, if that's what they want to supercharge, then our people will be able to participate. That shouldn't be an issue. It's within the agency, and there's the Veterans Affairs is a difficult agency to work with, and they're very slow. And at this moment, there is zero interest in creating some kind of a grandfather for our people who don't have a KCREP degree. So that's where we are. They are also hiring there at such a slow pace that there is no shortage of KCREP grads out there at all that are eligible for employment. Our challenge in the VA is to convince them to hire our people at all, even with their current job specs.
Okay. If there are not any other questions for Jim, we will sign off. We want to thank everybody for being here today. As always, you know, you can check our Connections website and post questions in there. Jim is frequently on our website making sure that he's updating, and we will continually update on this topic as we move forward into 2017 as well. So be on the lookout for new announcements for that. So without any other further ado, we will sign off.